Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. For literally 3 decades, Japan's economy was synonymous with just one word: stagnation. But suddenly, we're looking at a completely unexpected shift. I mean, we're talking about the sudden return of soaring inflation, a surging stock market, and these aggressive new government policies that are basically attempting to rewrite the rulebook for the world's fourth largest economy. But what does this all mean for the actual people living through it?
Here's how we'll break it all down. First, from bubble to lost decades. Then, real citizens, real inflation. Third, the high-pressure economy. Next, global shocks hit home. And finally, will this revival last?
All right, part one, from bubble to lost decades. So back in 1989, a massive asset bubble burst, triggering what is universally known as the lost decades. For roughly 30 years, Japan saw this agonizingly slow average growth of just 1%, along with persistent deflation. Companies hoarded cash, wages flatlined, and consumers just stopped spending. But jump to 2022 and inflation suddenly roars back. Fast forward to 2026, and the Nikkei stock index has literally smashed records, hitting an all-time high. On paper, it looks like an absolute macroeconomic victory.
Part 2. Real citizens, real inflation.
To understand what those big macroeconomic numbers actually mean on the ground, we have to look at the painful, day-to-day adaptations local businesses and young professionals are being forced to make. Take Sawada, for example, who ran a cafe. Rising ingredient costs completely squeezed her margins, so much so that she had to shrink her actual brick-and-mortar store into a mobile pop-up just to cut rent. Then there's Kubo, a patisserie owner. He had to hike his menu prices by 10%, meaning he now relies heavily on foreign tourists rather than local residents who just can't afford it anymore. And for IT professionals like Takahide, the severe sticker shock of Japan's new cost of living is just compounded by this exhausting struggle to find elusive, stable, full-time work.
Which actually brings us to a deep structural problem. Now, you might be wondering, if unemployment in Japan is incredibly low right now, we're talking just 2 or 3%, why aren't wages skyrocketing to attract workers? Well, roughly 4 in 10 workers are irregularly employed. That means short-term contracts or freelance gigs. You see, in Japan, permanent workers are a massive fixed cost because traditionally they can't be fired. So, during those lost decades, companies adapted by heavily relying on temporary workers to slash their overhead. And that culture of suppressing wages, it's carried right over into today's inflationary environment, leaving regular citizens totally strapped for cash.
Section 3. The high-pressure economy. Enter Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, who won a landslide election riding on a wildly ambitious economic agenda. Her policies have really struck a chord, with 4 in 10 young voters actively supporting her in recent polls. Think about it. These young people have lived their entire lives in a stagnant economy. They are desperately hoping her sweeping reforms will finally jumpstart their flatlining incomes and give them some real financial security. So the absolute core of her administration is the creation of what's called a high-pressure economy. Essentially, she's aiming to pump vast amounts of liquidity directly into the system. The working theory here is that by forcing up aggregate demand and putting disposable cash directly into consumers' pockets, corporations will be pressured into capital spending. And crucially, they'll be pressured into raising wages to match this newly created inflation. To actually pull this off, the government is using some incredibly aggressive fiscal tools. We're looking at a record 122.3 trillion yen expansionary budget. They're literally throwing direct citizen subsidies at the wall, 7,000 yen for energy, 20,000 yen per child, and even a proposed 0% consumption tax on food. On top of that, they pushed through a historic 6% minimum wage increase. Now, a wage increase sounds fantastic for workers, right? But remember our small business owner, Sawada? For local operators who are already being crushed by inflation, a state-mandated 6% labor cost hike is just another severe headache they have to figure out how to navigate.
When we compare this new model to the past, the contrast is absolutely staggering. During the lost decades, companies basically hoarded cash out of fear and just scaled down. Fast forward to today, and the current revival strategy relies on aggressive, state-led investments in 17 strategic sectors. We're talking physical AI systems, robotics, defense. The government literally wants to capture 30% of the global AI robotics market. So instead of shrinking just to survive, the state is actively trying to force economic expansion through major innovation.
Part 4. Global shocks hit home.
However, Japan is an island nation heavily reliant on imports, making this whole fragile domestic revival highly vulnerable. Let's say a conflict escalates in the Middle East. Well, because Japan gets about 90% of its oil shipments via the Strait of Hormuz, that disruption immediately causes imported fuel prices in Japan to hit record highs. Remember those gas tax cuts the government just implemented? Poof, they were instantly wiped out by global oil prices. Small operators, like a local food truck owner named Yasuda, saw their profit margins completely crushed all over again, forcing the government to awkwardly backtrack and reinstate caps and subsidies.
And, it's not just energy. International trade rows are hitting local businesses right where it hurts. Diplomatic tensions with China triggered a sudden massive ban on Japanese seafood imports. Now, this wasn't just some tiny macroeconomic blip. It completely devastated local seafood wholesalers like Yamaharu. This is a business that relied on China for nearly half of its export revenue, and suddenly, it cost them billions of yen. It just goes to show how easily external geopolitical pressures can break the back of domestic growth.
Which brings us to Section 5. Will this revival last?
With all these immense internal and external pressures squeezing both small businesses and the state budget, we really have to evaluate if this turnaround is sustainable. Because all of this government spending and money printing, it severely weakens the Japanese yen. And a weak yen makes importing all that crucial oil and food way more expensive. So to protect the yen, the Bank of Japan had to step in and raise interest rates to 0.75%. Now to us, that might not sound like much, but for Japan, it's the highest level seen in 3 decades.
But here's the catch. Raising rates is incredibly dangerous for them. Japan is one of the most indebted countries on the entire planet. They hold government liabilities at an absolutely staggering 240% of their GDP. When you have that much debt, even a tiny, microscopic increase in interest rates means the cost of simply servicing that debt skyrockets.
This creates an almost impossible paradox for the administration. As economists have pointed out, if the government tries to pay off this massive mountain of debt through higher taxes or by cutting the very subsidies keeping people afloat, they're going to choke off the economy. They would instantly kill the high-pressure strategy before it even has a chance to take off. They are walking a very thin tightrope between stimulating growth and triggering a full-blown debt crisis.
So as we look to the future, the primary indicators for success are pretty clear. First and foremost, will real wages for everyday citizens finally beat out inflation? Second, can those 17 strategic sectors actually generate the substantial profits needed to fund this whole experiment? Third, will terrified consumers actually start spending their money again? And lastly, and this is a big one, the administration is currently tightening foreign work visas to appease nationalistic sentiments. But how will shrinking the foreign workforce impact a country that is already desperate for labor? That contradiction could backfire spectacularly on small businesses that are literally crying out for staff.
Ultimately, this explainer leaves us with one massive, lingering question. After looking at the everyday struggles of local cafe owners, the aggressive gambles of the new administration, and the intense global pressures bearing down on the country, is Prime Minister Takaichi's bold agenda the true economic revival Japan has waited 30 years for? Or is it just a temporary high before the pressure drops and the country fades into yet another lost decade? It's a high-stakes experiment, and for sure, the entire world is watching.